So hello everyone and welcome to this informal chat of the Space Law Society of Georgetown with Daniel Porras. My name is Almuena Azcárate, or Almu for short. I am the Vice President of the Georgetown Space Law Society, and we are so happy to have Daniel today with us. Daniel is my to-go person on space weapons. When I first discovered the field of space security, Daniel was one of the first people I heard about. He used to work at UNIDA and they publish tons of stuff on space security. So I read a lot of those and they always had the name Daniel Porras attached to them. So I was very fortunate to contact him last year for a paper I wrote on space security for my space law class at Georgetown. And he was kind enough to help me out and give me some really useful advice. Daniel is currently working at Secure World Foundation, but as I said, he also worked at UNIDA, and he also was the Space Law Society president a few years ago. Was it in 2016?
It was the 2015-2016 academic year. Yeah, it's when I was getting my LLM.
Well, it's wonderful to be welcoming you back to the Space Law Society.
I was really hoping it would last.
Yes, I mean, honestly, it has had some, some ups and downs, but I think you guys, your board really kind of helped it, lift off, and we are just kind of reaping the benefits and trying to keep up the good work. So I am going to, give you the floor in case you want to say anything more about yourself, or if you just want to dive right into the topic.
Just to say that I'm really proud of y'all. Like, some of the stuff that Georgetown's been putting out recently on space law has been very exciting. I know I talked to some of the other alumni, and we all think that it's pretty remarkable, because space law wasn't really a hot topic for the longest time, especially when we were coming up. So it's great to see so many promising new young people who are getting into the field and doing them. They're just coming in so much better prepared than we ever were. So yeah, it gives us a lot of hope for how things are going to go in the future, even though it's kind of a mess right now.
That makes me so happy to hear that, honestly. We have a wonderful board this year. Christian is on the board. Laura Cummings, who is also on the board. She couldn't make it today, but she is the most passionate space law person that I know. And it's just, when you have passionate people, it's really easy to do good work.
Excellent. Well, let's do it. Let's talk about space weapons.
Okay, so what can you tell us about space weapons? I know that when we published this on Twitter, one of the things you said is that, can you really call them space weapons? Because what is a weapon? What did you mean by that exactly?
So we don't presently have a definition, an official definition for what is a space weapon. Some of you may have heard that somewhere along the way, the Russians and the Chinese proposed a draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. And that's something we can discuss in greater detail later. But the big criticism that always came out of that was, well, you said prevent the placement of weapons. Well, what is a weapon? A rocket, a missile, a satellite? It was very difficult to determine at what point a piece of technology became a weapon, in large part because everything in space, almost all the technology that we have, is either dual use, which isn't really the right term because that's a export-import control term, or multi-use. So dual use means that it can be used either by military or civilian actors. Multi-use means that almost anything can be used for a variety of applications. One of the best applications that we have right now, or best examples of this, are close proximity operation vehicles, or rendezvous proximity operation vehicles. So these are like the really small kind of satellite probe droid looking things that are going to go into orbit, and they can either repair or refuel or remove stuff from space. And they can do this in a variety of ways. Like, there's a university up in the UK, University of Surrey, that developed an active debris removal probe that uses either a net or a harpoon to catch debris and then drag it out of orbit. Well, that's great if a university is doing it to remove debris, but what happens when you put it in the hands of the military, for example? Well, the military could also use it to clean up debris, or they could use it to clean up somebody else's active military satellite. In that same sense, though, I mean, a commercial actor could do the same. So, because nobody wants to stifle innovation, we don't know what kinds of things we're going to be doing in space anytime soon. Nobody wants to put a moratorium or a prohibition on any of the technology, or at least a lot of the emerging or the current spacefaring nations. They don't want to put a moratorium on technology that would then inhibit development, especially in the commercial sector. So, for example, if we had decided that, oh, active debris removal vehicles can be used to attack satellites physically, therefore we're going to prohibit the deployment of any of these things. Well, great. We just threw away a perfectly useful tool. But again, a tool can become a weapon really easily. What makes a tool a weapon? Like, here, my coffee cup is serving a wonderful, service. It's holding my coffee and my spoon and like keeping me going through this lecture. But if I hit somebody over the head with it, now it's a weapon. So unfortunately, we haven't really been able to come to an agreement on how we want to tackle this problem. Now, admittedly, this problem is a bit of a artificial one, because nowhere in any international law do we define things like a nuclear weapon or a weapon of mass destruction. And yet we use the terms all the time. Not a problem. So in this particular instance, like, we find that there are a lot of other interests that are playing into it. And so we haven't really been able to have a discussion as to what a space weapon is. Another great example of how this is impacting us. So Secure World Foundation, we just published our April, or this is the 2021 edition of the Counterspace report. We call them counterspace capabilities. We refer to the capacity to be able to disrupt, deny, or degrade a satellite service. But we don't talk about weapons. We don't call them weapons. And in large part, it's because we don't want to get there yet. Or we don't want to put words into other states' mouths and say, like, oh, just because a certain technology is available doesn't mean that it's necessarily a weapon. So that's why I said, we're here talking about the laws and policies behind space weapons, but what is it? Well, what is a space weapon? Yeah, so let's start there.
That brings me to you mentioned the Chinese treaty proposal, the so-called PPWT. They actually pose a definition of could you tell us why that definition really, didn't take hold the international, or was it sort of rejected, so to say?
Okay, so there are two reasons. The official reason is it was too broad. It couldn't necessarily be defined. So they were talking about a space weapon, for example, or sorry, a weapon placed in space is the definition that they tried to come up with. But everything that defined what the weapon was based on intention. So they talk, for example, about like a weapon is anything that is intended to be used to destroy or degrade or harm another satellite. Okay, well, how do you know when something is intended for that purpose, or that it was built and designed for that purpose? There is a admittedly bullshit example that they would always give, which was like, well, what if I just take my satellite and then I go and ram it into somebody else's satellite? Okay, well, now your satellite has become a weapon. The reason I call it bullshit, though, is that understanding orbital mechanics, if a satellite is not intended to run into something else, it's like saying, yeah, I'm going to take my Jeep and ram a bus in Singapore that is traveling at 110 kilometers an hour, and I can only go at 20 kilometers an hour. Like, a lot of things would have to go right for you to be able to do that, let's be honest. But nevertheless, it is a legal theory. It's a legal concept. And we've tried to work with it as much as we can and try to find other avenues to get around this problem of, anything in space can theoretically be used for a weapon. And one of the trends that we're seeing right now in the international community, especially at the UN, is that folks are starting to move towards, rather than regulating technology, why don't we regulate behaviors? Okay, like, if you launch a satellite that's got tons of weapons on it, I can't see those weapons. I mean, at the moment, the best technology that we have for tracking, especially things like in low Earth orbit, which is mostly reliant on radar, it's a dot on a screen. Even when we're tracking a geo at best. We are starting to come out with certain LiDAR technologies that can actually do 3D mappings of the surface of a particular satellite, but then you can just use things to, cover up weapons in theory that you're sticking on a satellite. And so now nobody can see it. So if you can't verify that somebody has deployed a weapon and therefore violated their obligation not to place a weapon in space. What you can verify, though, is actions, or our actions. You can see that somebody shoots a space torpedo at somebody. You can see that somebody is jamming another satellite and trace the source of that jamming frequency to a particular object. You can tell when somebody launches an anti-satellite missile. These are things that you can actually hold people accountable for. And I think those are some more realistic ideas in terms of the technology that we have available to us today to be able to monitor, observe, track, and verify. And remember, when I say verify, we're talking about it in the strategic sense, which is you have to be able to spot that somebody's doing something wrong and then be able to do something about it before they can, let's say, attack you. That's how far the metric is. Christian, question.
Yeah, while you mentioned the interference topic, I'm at the FCC Satellite Division this semester, and have done some thinking about, what harmful interference means in a weapons context. And, obviously the FCC doesn't have to deal with that, but when interference could reach like the threshold of an aggressive action. And I was wondering if you had any perspective on that. The perspective is shrug.
I do. So I participated in the group of governmental experts on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. I got the incredibly fortunate opportunity to kind of be one of their in-house counsel. Almudena is now taking over that position, and so she will get to have the experience of seeing something that she wrote get ripped to shreds by very professional people, and then have them come up to her afterwards and say, "It's nothing personal." It's not. And I actually wouldn't. Disclaimer, I wouldn't be able to talk about any of this had states themselves not come out and talked about all of this and published a lot of the work that we did in that group of governmental experts. But one of the really fascinating conversations we had in there was we put all the different counterspace capabilities that currently exist on a spectrum. And we looked at, we had, kind of semi-annoying interference on the super low end. And then we had rods from God on the high end, which we were just doing that kind of as a joke. But anti-satellite missiles, ramming somebody's satellite, using a orbital vehicle to detonate and then destroy a satellite with shrapnel, that was all on the far extreme end. And we all said, okay, where on this line does intentional interference become a hostile action? When does it become an attack or the threat or use of force? No idea. Everybody had different ideas in terms of if you're using it against a commercial satellite, then it's just interference. But if you use it against a military satellite, then it's an attack. Well, okay, but a lot of commercial satellites now have they have both commercial and military transponders. So what? Is it, if it has more civilian transponders, that it's a civilian craft, or if it has just one military transponder, does that make it a military craft? And does that then amount to an attack? Does it have to be sustained? Can I jam you for, it was just 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then I cut it off and okay, well, now, sorry, it was just an accident. Can I fake it? Can I pretend sorry, I didn't know that I was broadcasting at this particular signal? We don't know. So we were never able to come up with an agreement. And that's one of the reasons it's so dangerous right now that we hear countries like NATO, for example, or a number of other countries saying things like, oh, well, if somebody attacks our satellite, that totally gives us permission to retaliate. So NATO actually did come out and said, if somebody attacks one of our satellites, it's sufficient to trigger Article 5 of the NATO Convention. Okay, well, then the next question is, what's an attack? And they said, well, we're not going to tell you. We're not going to tell you because we want everyone to keep guessing on this. I'm like, hey, Russia and NATO are actively testing each other out in the Arctic Circle right now. They're, different countries are doing military exercises, and look, we got a bunch of interference in our global positioning, or we got a bunch of interference in our comms. They're messing with each other. At some point, somebody is going to cross that threshold, and the other country that's being attacked is going to be like, oh, that's it. According to our policies, that's an attack. We're escalating, and now things get messy, especially if you start interfering with something like early launch warning capabilities.
Because it occurs to me, especially on the commercial side, all of that tracking and telemetry is public, so you would know exactly how to interfere with it.
And for all of you who know Professor Koplow, he is about to drop a bomb on the international community, in the United States, to be honest, talking about how the mixing of civilian and military services on a single satellite might actually be a violation of international humanitarian law, because it violates the concept of perfidy. Perfidy? Basically, it's where you...
Of distinction, yeah.
Yeah, no, but the whole idea that you're essentially pretending that something is a commercial satellite, but you're using it to attack people. That's tricky. And another concept I think we still have to go back to, sorry, now I'm rambling a bit. What is a space weapon? Most of the time when we're having this conversation, people talk about space weapons as being the thing that physically attacks something else. We don't talk about passive satellites as we currently use them for force projection as being a weapon. So for example, if the US military is using satellites to coordinate drone strikes in Syria, well, the drones are the weapon. Is the satellite a weapon? No, it's a force multiplier. Okay, this is a very Western concept. Other countries around the world don't buy that. They're like, no, of course the satellite's part of the weapon system. Like from the person who's pulling the trigger all the way to the thing that's dropping the bomb, that is a weapon system. So if I attack that satellite, that's fair game because you're using it to drop bombs on me. Okay, so what if it's a commercial satellite? What if the US government is leasing bandwidth from commercial operators to be able to carry out these military strikes? If somebody attacks that satellite in self-defense, who's in the wrong? Who can claim they're in the wrong? And the place where it really starts getting messy is insurance. If it's a commercial satellite that gets attacked in a military operation, guess what? Your insurance doesn't cover it, because there are two main things that your insurance doesn't cover: acts of God and acts of war. A lot of insurance companies could potentially be left on the hook, particularly for jamming. And if we want examples of that, we can look at what happened with Eutelsat back in 2012, 2013, when the Iranians were jamming a Eutelsat satellite because they wanted to block BBC Persia and Al Jazeera English during the Arab Spring. They said, this is propaganda. The Western countries are trying to destabilize our regime. So they were jamming them. But then Eutelsat came back and was like, that's great, but you're knocking out all of our services from the satellite to the entire region. And that's costing us millions a day. Ultimately, the French government had to step in and deal with it diplomatically. And it was fascinating.
So it seems to me that a lot of the things that you've described have to do, as you said before, less with just the capabilities of the space technology, but more about the behaviors of the people using it.
How people are using it.
So you mentioned before that in the UN, the international community is, pushing for starting to think about behaviors more and less about technical capabilities. And if I'm not mistaken, you are referring, for the people who might not know, to the UK resolution that was proposed earlier in 2020. Do you want to talk a bit about that, and if you think this has a chance to succeed where other avenues have failed?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. And now we're going to start getting into the diversity stuff, which is really important. So for a while now, there has been a lot of discussion over the development, or like the, I guess, explicit adoption of norms of behavior. And norms of behavior are essentially standards of conduct that people do, even if it's not necessarily considered to be a law, but that it's just the way that you're supposed to act. So for example, it's not a law that you're supposed to shake people's hands, but it's polite. So you do it so that you don't, kind of get ostracized and become an outcast. There are some norms of behavior which are codified. So traffic, for example, like everybody drives on a side of the road. Let's say the right side of the road. Brits, if any of you are out there, learn to drive on the right side of the road. that is a norm that everyone does. You don't necessarily have to, if nobody's watching you, but it's also codified in law and says, okay, you have to do this. But it's been really hard to adopt a treaty in space for the last the Moon Agreement was adopted in 1977. I guess you could call the International Space Station Agreement an international one. It's not really it's plurilateral. But certainly on arms control, there's been nothing. So for a while, probably since about early 2000s, there's been talk about, okay, rather than coming up with a treaty, because obviously we're not going to be able to come to an agreement on a legally binding instrument, why don't we talk about some politically binding instruments? So that, okay, if a state breaks the rule, then you can be shamed, but at least there's no legal ramifications. And the Western countries tend to favor this more, largely because the United States wants to. And that's largely because the United States is still the big kid on the hill when it comes to developing counter space capabilities. There's no denying it. Like Russia, China, they are playing catch up. Let's not kid ourselves. And so we got this whole discussion going about norms. The European Union back in 2012 also tried to get an international code of conduct going that would kind of lay out what are some baseline behaviors that people should just be observing. Things like, don't create debris intentionally. That collapsed, but for diplomatic reasons, not necessarily for substantive reasons. And we still just haven't been able to get anywhere. So the UK has very courageously come out and said, let's start a new initiative, everyone. We got to start talking about space security in a way that actually identifies problems, identifies threats to space systems, and then we figure out some ways to move beyond it. So here's what we would like to do. We would like to address challenges to space security through principles, rules, and norms of behavior. It's a very broad call. What they've done is the UN General Assembly approved it. They've asked the Secretary General to ask all the UN member states, hey, one, what are the biggest threats to space systems in your opinion? Mind you, threats to space systems, not threats from space systems. Two, what do you think should be some norms of behavior? Like, what do you consider to be some responsible standards for actions? And three, what do you think are some ways that we can actually move forward? So all UN member states have been invited to submit their comments. For the record, academia is also invited to make submissions, and Secure World Foundation is the first to get their submission in. So if anybody would like to read our comments, you could probably find it on Twitter. It's about 3 pages. And it's just basically some ideas on, okay, what do we think are the biggest problems? What do we think should be some good standards of behavior? And then what do we think could be some ways that we move forward? I've been banging on about anti-satellite test guidelines for quite some time. This is a lot of the research that I was doing while I was at Unidir. As many of you know, people have started blowing satellites up in orbit. The United States and the Soviets did it a bit during the 60s and 70s, and then kind of quit doing it. But then, sorry, I think my dog just knocked something over. Then in 2007, China blew up a satellite, one of their weather satellites, at almost 1,000 kilometers. That debris is never coming out of orbit, and China is never going to stop hearing about it. They get really sensitive about it too. It's been like 13 years of naming and shaming for them. The following year, the United States, during Operation Burnt Frost, also conducted a demonstration. They had an excuse, at least, so we don't call it a test. But they blew it up at around 230 kilometers, and that debris stayed up there for, 18 months? Considerably longer than they had anticipated. And then in March of 2019, while I was in a group of governmental experts on the prevention of an arms race in outer space, the Indians blew up one of their satellites at 280 kilometers in orbit. Just to give you a sense of scale, if anybody of you is actually in the space community, you've probably heard of Dr. Mariba Jha down at UT Austin. He has tracked debris from the Indian ASAT test up to 1,000 kilometers in orbit. The International Space Station flies at 400 kilometers in orbit. So you cannot determine where this stuff is going to fly. We just don't have that modeling capability at this time. But when you destroy something, it becomes a problem for everyone, including yourself. So we've identified this as one possible area where everybody's interests converge. Tons of people have been advocating a moratorium on kinetic anti-satellite testing for a while, including Doug Lavero, who is in a lot of ways the father of Space Force. because it just doesn't benefit anyone. So in my research, I proposed three guidelines. So it's 3 principles in 5 words: no debris, low debris, notification. So no debris, if you're going to test anti-satellite weapons, we're not saying you can't have them, you can't develop them, but don't hit anything and don't create debris. 2, low debris. If you have to hit something, do it below. I've proposed 200 kilometers because you can still conduct mid-course intercept testing, so intercontinental ballistic missile testing below 200 kilometers, I think. But that way you also don't have the problem of creating debris. And we avoid getting into a diplomatic kerfuffle with the Defense Department, and everybody knows that once defense comes in, it's over. And then 3, notification. Notify anybody who could potentially be impacted by it. If you're going to blow stuff up, there could be some really expensive satellites nearby that you're just not aware of, or that you didn't even bother checking on. A lot of the testing has, so like when India did theirs, they were pretty careful to make sure that their satellite was going to be flying over a pretty empty space. But still, it's just coasting now, and you can't control that debris. So hopefully we might be able to get to something really small, and I don't want to call it meaningless, but it will seem trivial. Like, to come up with anti-satellite test guidelines, it's such a bonehead idea that you're like, great job, guys. You have to remember, the international community moves very, very slowly, and technology moves fast. So if we can even get one tiny little step going forward, that's a huge victory. And then the next time we come back for another conversation, then maybe they can be a little bit more ambitious. But for the time being, baby steps.
No, absolutely. And one of the things you just said, that technology moves very fast. One of the things that has been happening in the space community, well, 2 other things is that, you know, at the very beginning, it was just the US and the then Soviet Union doing their thing. So obviously, you know, space was less contested. It was easier to reach agreements like the Outer Space Treaty. But the more players you get, the more difficult that becomes. And also because now technology is, you know, we know more things about space, we know more things about space technology. So everything just moves a lot faster. And one of the things that has been happening is that since there isn't much in the way of regulations limiting what you can do in space, people are, you know, they are free to do essentially whatever they want. And one thing that that, you know, that is very prevalent in the space field that maybe isn't as prevalent in other domains is that you know, there is almost an encouragement of mixing the military with the civilians. So this kind of like I don't know what to call it. There's I don't know what term to use, but this kind of like mix. And it's almost like it's encouraged because that gives you a source of freedom to do whatever you want. Because obviously, if my satellite is going to be used for civilian purposes, other people are going to be less likely to target it because they, you know, they don't want to risk targeting something that's civilian. Can you talk about this mix and the advantages that it has and the disadvantages that it has?
So this is actually a problem that we've been trying to bring up with the commercial sector for a while, and they don't think it's really that big a deal. The US government in particular, but I think the Europeans and a lot of other Western countries, we always refer to them as the WEOG, the Western European and Other Group. This is an official UN term. They see leveraging the commercial space sector for military advantages very favorably. It's easy. There are a lot of companies out there who are doing some really exciting things, and it is much easier to get somebody else to build a satellite, launch it, put it in orbit, operate it, and then you just kind of lease the service from them. That way you don't have to put up all your own stuff. This paradigm has largely existed under the notion that space is safe. Once you put something in space, well, that's it. It's in space. No one's going to be able to touch it. Like, nobody can attack it. Nobody can shoot it with a gun. Nobody can go and hit it with a hammer. Like, well, it's way the hell up there. That is not so much the case anymore. And I'm not even coming at this from the like anti-satellite, oh, if I have missile defense, I can blow up a satellite. No. Electronic interference and jamming is not that hard. The technology is out there. It's readily available. You can buy it on Amazon. All you need is a powerful enough power source. you know, Syria, Iran, North Korea, like all these countries are able to engage in this. North Korea was actually jamming the GPS signals. They were spoofing the GPS signal from Seoul airport for like 3 weeks. Yeah, it was something like 3 weeks. So all the planes that were coming into Seoul airport were losing their GPS signal. They had to use other means to land, like pilot competency. The technology is out there. It's not that hard to interfere with a space system. So what we're seeing now is, there was a time when people thought, oh, if you just get the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese to come to an agreement on space security, well, then it's done deal. Everybody else will just fall in line. Why would they? They don't have to. The technology is getting more and more pervasive. And a lot of countries are going to start seeing this as an opportunity to protect themselves. And if the United States continues to invest in commercial satellites, and those commercial satellites are being used to carry out military operations, congratulations, you are now a legitimate military target. You're fair game. And so this whole notion that satellites can be used for military purposes and still be considered as peaceful purposes is going to get rattled quite a bit, because a number of countries who in the past couldn't have done anything about a satellite, now they're going to start saying, well, whatever, people are using these satellites to attack us, well, let's take them down. Find a way to interfere with them, find a way to mess with them. And it's going to start creating problems for industry. Now, a couple of years ago, Unidir and Secure World Foundation held an informal consultation with industry about space security. And Brian Whedon went up there and he gave this great presentation about space security and all the different challenges that are coming up and all the counter space threats. And so he asked them, like, okay, so what are your biggest concerns? Like, are you worried about jamming? Are you worried about debris from ASATs? And they were like, nah, we're not really worried about any of that. I mean, if it gets more difficult to operate in space, the government will just pay us more to operate in space and we just make more money. Really what we're worried about is space traffic. I'm like, okay. And it's actually been really hard to get the commercial sector to participate, in large part because they don't want to piss off any of their clients. I mean, DoD, it's your whoever you are in working in the space sector, you want that contract from the DoD. You want that contract from DARPA. Governments are still the biggest customers, not the biggest actors, the biggest customers. So we'll see. But like I said, Professor Koplow's paper is a bombshell. And I know the International Committee on the Red Cross, the ICRC, has been looking at this for quite some time. And they've been asking me for a while, like, hey, can we get a study going on what the humanitarian impacts would be of conflict in space? And my answer is always, that's too complicated for one person to do. You need an entire team of people looking at this, because we don't know what the consequences would be. We don't know what would happen if we had widespread ASAT kinetic shootouts. We don't know what would happen if all of a sudden 50 or 60 countries really started using jamming capabilities to the regularly. Hacking. We know the Chinese have managed to get into a couple of American satellites once or twice. I'm sure the Americans have done it to the Russians and the Chinese. What happens if somebody shuts off GPS? Actually, that one we do know. There was a report that came out about a year ago, 2 years ago. They estimated that if GPS went out, the United States alone, not the world, but like the United States alone, would hemorrhage $2 billion a day. A day. And that's best case scenario. I can't imagine how the rest of the world would function. And unfortunately, none of the other GPS systems or GNS, global navigation satellite systems, are fully operational yet. And we've seen Galileo go out a couple of times for like days. Can you imagine if you didn't have your GPS for days? No Uber Eats, no like a lot of your package tracking would be gone. Hell, the New York Stock Exchange would come to a halt, because all financial transactions have to have a timestamp from the atomic clock located on the GPS. Imagine if the New York Stock Exchange came to a halt, how much money we would lose every single day. I mean, it would be like the Suez Canal problem times 1,000. So we don't know. And that's part of the reason why the international community is working so hard right now to try and get ahead of this thing, because we don't know what the consequences could be, and they could be really messy.
Absolutely. It's mind-boggling how important space is for everything we do. Like, every time I think I know it, I discover new things that make me think, wow, it's incredible if we lost space capabilities.
And to that end, sorry to keep babbling. I do want to touch on the diversity thing. One of the issues that my boss, Peter Martinez, always brings up is the importance of having any of these norms, any of these measures, whatever comes out, everything has to be, he calls it being culturally sensitive, in the sense that everybody has to be able to follow the rules. Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty contains the principle of freedom of access to space. Everyone should be allowed to go to outer space. But everyone is also using outer space every single day. The amount of stuff that we rely on, great example, I was in a conference in New Delhi, and the French ambassador noted that the average Indian, the average Indian relies on at least 11 satellites a day. Now, let's not kid ourselves, okay? The average Indian, unfortunately, in this day and age, is still very impoverished. There's a wonderful growing middle class. There are some really wealthy people in India, but the average Indian, and this is a country of over 1 billion people, is still living under conditions that here in the Western countries we would consider to be impoverished. 11 satellites a day. How many satellites a day do you think you rely on? It's pretty hectic. And so when we have these conversations about space security, everybody has a stake in it. I don't care if you're Burkina Faso, I don't care if you're Jamaica or if you're Chile. Like, you could be living in the bottom of the world or the furthest point in the southern hemisphere, and you too have a stake in space data. So when we have these conversations at the multilateral level, there's none of this about like, oh, well, those people don't really matter. Oh yeah, they do. You know, they're hooked on space. Everyone's hooked on space now. So it's really important, I think, to make sure that we're having a very inclusive conversation, as much of a pain in the ass as it is. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you got to go together. And unfortunately, especially with space, everyone is going to be an actor sooner or later. Everyone's going to have to play by whatever rules we come up with. And if we start alienating actors today, then tomorrow they're going to say, why should I comply? Why should I play with you? It's the same as the climate change discussion. And that has become a really big problem. A lot of developing countries out there are saying, why should I adhere to these restrictions when all these other rich countries already screwed everything up and got rich off of it and left us in the lurch? No way. So really important to make sure that just because somebody's a small country and doesn't have a space force doesn't mean that they don't belong at the table.
Absolutely. On that note, we actually have some questions in the chat. Robert Ray asks, if after states provide feedback on the UK resolution on responsible behaviours in outer space, would you recommend an open-ended working group to resolve the differences and recommend a way forward?
So many people in an open-ended working group. There is an open-ended working group right now.
Or a group of experts.
Okay, so the two problems. For those of you that don't know, many times when the United Nations breaks down into working groups, they'll do it in one of two ways. One is an open-ended working group, and that's basically everyone. Anybody can come in, anybody can sit in and provide input, or any UN member state. This is great for those instances where you need a lot of input. There's an open-ended working group going on cyber right now, on cybersecurity, moving very slowly. They're all going together, but it's moving slowly. Then you have what are called groups of governmental experts, which are very small working groups. But a group of governmental experts is not supposed to have diplomats. It's supposed to have experts. It's not representatives of the government. They're people who are assigned by the government, but they're supposed to be objective participants. And whatever recommendations come out of that group of governmental experts do not necessarily reflect the position of those countries. Well, that whole thing has gone out the window. GGEs have basically turned into just smaller diplomatic meetings, which is a shame because I think a group of governmental experts can actually be really useful. What would be the best way to go forward? I do think a smaller group to hammer out a proposal first would be critical. Maybe get 25, so like the group of governmental experts that we had on Paros, I thought was a great collection. It's 25. There were 25 representatives, all geographically diverse. So we had, you know, the U.S., Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, France, India, Kenya, South Africa, Egypt. Oh man, Egypt is like the diplomatic James Bond of the UN. Their representative is excellent. You know, countries like that, and Brazil was chairing the whole thing. I think in a working group like that, you can come up with a good idea, and then you take it to the plenary. People are going to have input. People are going to want to change it up a little bit. But I think it's better to have something to put on the table first. And you should be sounding everybody out as you're building this thing anyway, like getting as much information from maybe regional groups, from academia, from the commercial sector, so that by the time the proposal comes out, everyone kind of already knows what's in it. But it's going to be hard, really hard. We'll see what happens. To note on that, the Russians and the Chinese are probably also going to call for another working group or a group of governmental experts on a legally binding instrument. So we could have two initiatives going ahead together.
And so you talk about the benefits of small groups, which I agree, but they also obviously have disadvantages. There is a question by Haley or Hallie, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, I'm really sorry. She asks, what are your thoughts on bottom-up lawmaking or the Artemis Accords? Because obviously the Artemis Accords, one of the things that some people criticize is that it was like a small group, and then everybody that wanted to join the club had to comply by it. And the same thing could be said of the European Code of Conduct, for example.
Yeah. So the bottom-up approach works really well, in particular for industry. So in terms of right now, I'm trying to get this working group going on right-of-way. So industry-led, we're trying to talk about if two satellites are going to crash into one another, what are some of the elements or factors that you would take into consideration to figure out who's going to move? I think bottom-up approaches on that front work great. Unfortunately, when we're talking about space security, God damn it, it always comes down to the countries that have the nuclear weapons, because space security ultimately is about strategic security. That is the driving force behind it. And in that sense, I think there can be a groundswell of support from from the bottom, if you will. So a lot of the developing countries and maybe even getting up to some of the middle space powers, I think they can create a groundswell of momentum or pressure that will then force some of the strategic powers to actually get their act together. So U.S., Russia, China, might as well throw it in India, UK, France. What other nuclear powers are we to worry about? Maybe Israel as well. They are not going to move on some of the space security issues because they're too closely tied to their strategic elements. You're going to need countries like a Sweden, like a Brazil, like a UAE, or Brazil really is my champion for everything. It'd be great if India came along, maybe in Australia or New Zealand. New Zealand is a great champion for sustainable space activities. It's going to have to be countries like these that say, look, enough is enough. We've got way too much at stake in this. And there are just certain actions you're not going to be able to do, because if you do, you're going to screw it up for the rest of us.
Yes, we have another question from Cecilia Petchmees. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your surname correctly. She says, how do you explain Russia's and China's willingness to regulate through legally binding instruments, given the reluctance to apply international law in conventional warfare?
Yeah, about that. So Russia and China are other end of the coin that we're talking about right now with the UK resolution. So there are threats to space systems, but then there are also threats from space systems. Russia and China don't give a shit what the United States is doing in terms of like trying to attack, weather satellites or anything like that, or trying to spy on industrial communications. What they're worried about is that the United States is going to develop a missile defense system that will actually negate their nuclear deterrent. So if I've talked to any of the rest of y'all about this, I'm sorry I'm going back to the old Mexican standoff metaphor, but right now, U.S., Russia, and China are involved in a nuclear Mexican standoff, which is where everybody has guns pointed at each other. Nobody wants to shoot because the first person that shoots, everyone dies. It's a very heated situation. But the United States has been developing missile defense for a while. Now, it doesn't really work. The United States cannot stop incoming ICBMs either from Russia or China. So I don't even know why the hell we're talking about hypersonics. It's like, you can beat me with a baseball bat. Why do you need to go get a tank? Everybody's just essentially preparing themselves for the United States to suddenly have a magical shield that would prevent a nuclear attack from reaching American shores. Now, the reason that's a problem, I know everybody else thinks it's like, oh, great, now we're shielded from nuclear attack. Yeah, but then that means Russia and China wouldn't be able to hit back. So for them, the reason that they need counter space capabilities is to make sure that the U.S. doesn't get an edge. And essentially what this is the U.S., if the U.S. gets out of the whole mutually assured destruction paradigm, then there's nothing to stop them from attacking. If we're all going to live, we all have to live under the specter of potential death. That's the game. And if you destabilize that balance, then all of a sudden somebody has an advantage and somebody has the edge to attack. So the United States has been putting a lot of money into missile defense for a long time, and a lot of it is based on satellites. Early warning detection, radar, all that stuff. Now, Russia and China aren't so much worried about that necessarily, but the thing that they've been worried about since the 1980s is Star Wars. Ronald Reagan has been banging on about putting satellites in space that would then be able to shoot down any incoming missile ever. If any of you have ever heard of the Union of Concerned Scientists, in particular one very brilliant researcher over there named Dr. Laura Grego, she put together a video that shows you exactly why space-based missile defense is utter crap. I want a unicorn too. You don't see me getting one anytime soon. But the United States continues to pump money into field research on this stuff. And every single time they do that, even if it's just like $4 million here, $4 million there, the Russians and the Chinese get a little bit more nervous because they really think that at some point the US is going to deploy this thing. Now, whether they really think it or not, that's also a mixed question. I've asked them this. I'm like, dude, you've seen the science. Like, it doesn't work. And they're like, Daniel, these are the same people who put somebody on the moon in 1969 just to prove a point. Like, if they're going to be pushing, we got to push too. And Donald Trump didn't help the situation at all. And he didn't help it because he didn't know like when not to use certain words. So, for example, it was US policy for the longest time that missile defense was only for rogue nations, only for Iran and only for North Korea. So all the missile defense that we were developing was only technically supposed to be to prevent those rogue nations from attacking our allies. And then Donald Trump comes along and, like, not even thinking about what he's talking about, says, no, we're going to have the greatest missile defense system that's ever been. It's going to be able to shoot down anything coming at us from anyone, anywhere, at any time, and we're going to be totally protected. Congratulations, you just upset nuclear strategic balance that has existed since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Go ahead. Go tell Russia and China that they can't develop anti-satellite weapons. Like, one of the problems that I often find in these discussions also is that we, especially over here in the West, we lack a lot of empathy for the rest of the world. We always view things through our lens, but we don't view it through the eyes of others. And look, get a Russian friend, get a Chinese pen pal. You will find that, like, those people are just like us. They're not evil, and they have every right to defend themselves as well. So I think oftentimes we need to stop talking about trying to gain the strategic advantage or to be able to overwhelm our adversaries and talk a little bit more about how do we make this not be an issue? Like, how do we make it so that there isn't a need for there to be this strategic arms race? And if we can't solve that problem, then I don't think space or space assets are our biggest worry. We got bigger issues down here.
Absolutely agree. And I think from these two last questions, from your answers to these questions, one thing that we can get from that is that there is always a delicate balance between, a desire to work with the international community, but always as long as the national security of each individual country that is negotiating isn't affected. So that is a very delicate balance that has to be achieved. We are coming up on the 12 o'clock time. I don't know if you have any last words, any last recommendations that you'd like to give to everyone that's here today.
Yeah, I'll give you my. I like to close on this point. Again, going back to diversity, especially in the security field, one of the elements that I've always loved so much, and then you're going to see this when you get to Geneva. Space security conversations are so geographically diverse. You've got people from all over the world. So, you've got Americans, you've got Russians, you've got Chinese, you've got Indians, you've got Europeans. It's fabulous, like the whole rainbow of human diversity. But then you very quickly start figuring out that everybody who comes to the discussions at this table share very similar characteristics. We're all political science related or military related, security related, maybe kind of diplomatic corps. And then we're all dudes. And most of us are old dudes or older dudes. I mean, I was one of the youngest people in the room by decades. And so I started noticing that just about everybody analyzes the problems almost exactly the same. I mean, maybe a little bit, there are some cultural differences, but by and large, because we all kind of come from this zero-sum background, that we're constantly competing. We're always trying to figure out, like, how do you get one over the next person? I don't think that's necessarily going to solve our problems, especially not in outer space where the physics of it really require a great deal of harmonization. So we just need to get different ways of looking at the problem, looking at the issues, and thinking about it. So for me, when I was in the room, I kept saying, I need fresh ideas. I'm running out of ideas. Who else can we get in the room who thinks differently from us? And the two demographics that we kept identifying were women and young people. So y'all, get on it. Find ways to make yourselves heard. It's really important. If you've ever heard of like Space Generation Advisory Council or the Space Court Foundation, the Georgetown Space Law Society, get involved. Find ways to reach out to the international community. They're very open. We love nerding out about this stuff. We love just like babbling all the time. So definitely, we need your help because I am running out of ideas and whiskey.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Well, it will maybe make you happy to know that loads of people from all around the world signed up for this event today. We had like a very diverse group of people that joined us today, and this should give us hope, for the future. I think space is becoming more and more popular. We see that in the Space Law Society. Loads of people want to get involved because, let's not lie to ourselves. Space is really cool. Like, who wouldn't want to work in space, right? So I echo that statement of yours, and I would just to close up, I would really like to thank you all that came here today to chat with us. Thank you, Daniel, especially for taking the time.
Just before I go, here is, boom, there's my email address. If anybody wants to get in touch, talk about space security, talk about how to get into this field, need some advice on just kind of like which way to look, feel free to drop me a line. And I don't know everything, but I know a lot of people who do.
Thank you so much. And also, Daniel gave you his email address. We posted the Space Law Society's email address before, but I'm going to post it again. And with that, thank you so much to everyone, and see you next time.
Cheers, y'all.